Lamb, or Dýrið, as it's in Icelandic, which actually means like the animal or the beast, which kind of gives you a bit more context to the story. So it's an Icelandic film directed by Valdimar Jóhannsson, and it stars Noomi, Rapace, just need to read these names because they're really hard to pronounce, Hilmir, Snær, Guðnason, and Björn, Hlynur, Haraldsson, and then like a whole cast of animals who are phenomenal. And it's also jointly written by Valdimar Jóhannsson and Sjóhannsson. He's quite a famous Icelandic author, and he also wrote the screenplay for The Northman. Yeah, so let me just talk about the things that I really kind of found fascinating in this movie. Almost hidden meanings, or things that most people perhaps wouldn't have noticed in reviewing this movie unless you know a lot about folklore and literature, because there's literally references all throughout this. When the film opens, it is on Christmas Eve, which, if you know anything about folklore, specifically Northern European folklore, and in this case Icelandic folklore, is that nothing good happens on Christmas Eve. In folk tales, there's always trolls coming down from the mountains to kidnap naughty children. There's the Yule lads, there's 13 of them that come on the run up to Christmas. Back in the day, they used to kidnap kids, but then they kind of softened and just became a bit cheeky and mischievous. I think it was like in the Victorian era that change happened, which also reflects the change in fairy tales from the gruesome Grimm brothers and Hans Christian Andersen versions to the Disneyfication versions. But yeah, so essentially nothing good ever happens on the run up to Christmas. And in the case of this film, a entity comes along and impregnates a sheep. So it's almost a twist on the stealing of children. Instead of stealing them, it actually brings life into the farm. So because there's no children to steal, perhaps he gives life this entity, which will become revealed later. Essentially, the festive season is ripe for the folk horror genre, though in Lamb, that's where the traditional folktale influences ends, as the rest is just weirdness from the mind of the director. I've read like a couple of reviews and like interviews with Valdimar Jóhannsson, and he did actually say a lot of his influences were paintings. And so there's like one particular painting that you can kind of see the tone of the movie and perhaps the colour palette, which is very interesting. Like, I love when directors are inspired by art, that they kind of weave that into their movie, so that's fantastic. I read somewhere that this film took years and years to make. Like, in terms of writing it, they wrote this over years, and you can tell that when you watch the movie, everything happens at precisely the right moment. So like, one of the earliest examples is quite quickly after the opening sort of prologue. Our two main characters, husband and wife, Maria and Ingvar, they share a meal together and have a conversation. Ingvar talks about time travel and how it has been proven to be theoretically possible. But then he says, quite tellingly, that he has no interest in the future because he's quite happy where he is right now in his life. He's quite content with his existence as a sheep farmer, and just everything is just okay. Whereas Maria wistfully then says, going to the past would be just as possible as going to the future. And the way this conversation unravels, you know that Ingvar is avoiding talking about the past because something's happened and he's probably responsible for this thing happening. Whereas Maria feels like she could perhaps go back and change the thing that happened. And it just so happens, as the film slowly unravels, it comes to pass that they had a child called Ada and she died. And so then that earlier conversation then gets pulled back into focus and you think, oh crap, of course. That's the painful thing in their past. And so then when this hybrid lamb is born, and there's this great moment in the movie where it's lambing season, so it jumps forward to spring, and they're helping the sheep birth lambs, and they just share a look with each other. No words are spoken, but you can tell by the way they look at each other something is bizarre. And then slowly we get to see what is bizarre, and it's this lamb, which is a hybrid, and you don't see the difference in the lamb for a very long time until suddenly you see that, oh, it's bloody humanoid. So in a way, like, centering the story on grief isn't anything new, but the way that this film explores grief is fascinating, because you can see this new Ada, they call it the same name, which is a bit, ugh. Why would you do that? You're just asking for trouble, aren't you? But you could see this new life as their do-over as parenting, and they cherish this lamb to the point of being quite, like, obsessive about it. And the lamb is so cute. She is the sweetest thing ever, and in a way you would think that this is supposed to be a horror movie because it starts off very much in that vein, but the cute lamb is also then followed around by a soundtrack, but the soundtrack, most importantly, is very, like, discordant, very dark and brooding, and the fact that this little cuteness is also, like, in a very stark world. I'm gonna read what I wrote here because I'm just rambling now. The cute little hybrid lamb Ada is harmless. In fact, she's quite delightful, but it must be noted that Ada's presence is haunted by a brooding, menacing soundtrack, which is coupled with sweeping vistas of gorgeous Icelandic landscapes that dominate the screen in all their ominous grandeur and sparseness, and small, frigid domestic interiors that simmer with a rise in drama, both captured in cold, toned colour palettes. It's a concoction of elements that signals to the audience that all is not fine and creates tension that slowly builds to a crescendo by the close of the film. Like, the mise-en-scène tells you that something's going on here. That, coupled with this ominous music, again acts as a warning. Then Ingvar's brother, Pétur, comes into town very strangely, like he's in the back of the car and gets thrown out by these people. That never really gets explained why he's just chucked out like that. But yeah, like, it might just be because they're, like, begrudgingly taking him there. I don't really know, like, he owes them money, and they're just, like, chucking him out so he can go and get it. Maybe that's it. But yeah, he comes to the farm and he is completely freaked out, but very subtly freaked out by the behaviour of his brother and his brother's wife, because it suddenly is revealed to him at the dinner table that there's this bloody lamb human thing, and he's like, what the fuck is going on here? You two are absolute nutters, essentially. And they kind of are, but the way it's played, it's like almost, it's like magical realism. Like, everything else is normal, except from this one thing. And the way they behave is just very uncanny, because it's like, don't you realise this is weird? And so that's what Pétur brings to the film, is just this kind of, he becomes almost on a level with the audience, because he's like, this is weird, and we're also thinking this is weird. He then also tries to kill the lamb, but then decides not to, and then there's like a really cute moment of him snuggling with the lamb. Right, I'm just going to talk about literary references now, because I like books, and so when anyone is reading a book on screen, I'm all over it. In one scene, Maria is reading Mikhail Bulgakov's Heart of a Dog, which I haven't read myself, but I've researched it. Like, years ago I was researching Mikhail Bulgakov because I wanted to read something of his, because he is a known satirist of the Soviet era. It's about a man who performs an operation on a dog to make it more human-like. Hello? Human hybrid animal human things. She's reading a book about a dog human hybrid, and its existence ruins the main character's life. In a way, the plot of Lamb follows a very similar course. By the end, that lamb's presence in these people's lives has ruined their lives. Then there's another book that is featured in the movie. It's a Icelandic fairy tale, a child's book, and it's called The Story of Dimmlim, and it's about like this little princess, and she goes for like walks and then befriends a swan, and then the swan dies, but then it transpires that the swan wasn't actually a swan, it was just a little boy who was under a curse. And then he and Dimmlim go off together. In a way, you could see the final moments of Lamb as a reverse of that fairy tale. Ada's human father dies and she is taken away by Ram Man, which is a humanoid ram. So it's like, in the fairy tale, the animal is replaced by the human, whereas in this, the human is replaced by the animal. So it's interesting in that respect. Then there's also a line in the story that kind of feeds into the atmosphere of this film. A harsh but very true sentiment, and it basically says, but nothing stays the same for very long in this life. And while Maria, Ingvar, Ada and Pétur, to a certain extent, find happiness as a family, their days are numbered. And then perhaps the biggest influence, but it's not explicitly shown in the movie, is references to the sagas. So the Icelandic sagas have very much a permeating effect on a lot of things that come out of Iceland, because they are legendary stories that one of the greatest things in literature to have come out of the country. But I'm just going to read this out. Oh, this is such a crap video, sorry everyone, but I wrote it much better than I can say it. Another literary connection you could make is in the country's rich storytelling history of the medieval Icelandic sagas, the Icelandic Sagas. In these stories, blood feuds are settled with revenge, supernatural occurrences pop up all over the place, and fate is all-consuming. One particular example is Grettir's saga. There is a scene in the saga where Thorhall, a farmer, much like Lamb's protagonists, tries to locate his horses, but they mysteriously disappear. While looking for them, he ends up running into Glam, a Swedish shepherd who he has been advised to employ, which he does. After this interaction, Thorhall then finds his horses where he left them. It's as if the very landscape of Iceland is working against Thorhall to make sure that he meets Glam so that fate can happen. And it just then so happens that Glam gets cursed, dies, becomes a ghost, and then wreaks havoc at Thorhall's farm, which then Grettir has to come along and defeat him. Similarly, in the film, so where you could see that whole thing translating onto this movie is when Ada goes missing and a storm descends, like just a massive misty storm cloud descends over the landscape. Again, it's as if nature is working against Ingvar and Maria to allow the hybrid lamb's mother, like the normal sheep, to spend time with her babe. Nature is conspiring against these two humans to make sure that this lamb can be with its mother, but then it forces Maria's hand, because she is jealous. She decides to kill it because it starts like bleating outside her window. It won't leave them alone, and so then she decides, because this is the final straw, it took her new child away from her, it has to die, so then she kills it. But yeah, so this moment, so nature takes the lamb away from them, and it then invokes fate to happen. That mirrors what happens in Grettir's saga. Yeah, so it sets in motion Maria's subsequent execution of Ada's birth mother and Ingvar's death at the hand of Ram Man, who has taken on the task of avenging his kin, just like in the sagas. So I think that's really interesting as well, like how all these parallels from these texts can be seen in the movie. And it's almost, like I said, I don't know if anyone's ever analysed this movie this way, which I guess that's kind of cool that I've got a different perspective of it, perhaps. And then another way you could interpret the film is that it's a fable. And so Maria and Ingvar steal Ada the lamb from nature. Maria kills an innocent ewe, and the ram man, who could be a stand-in for nature, retaliates to restore the balance. Lamb could then be seen as a climate change fable, selfishly pillaged from nature, and there will be consequences. So that's essentially, I think, what I wanted to say about this movie. I love stuff like this. Like, some people just don't enjoy this film at all, and I'm one of the people that I think it's phenomenal. I love how weird, wacky, almost silly it is, but very serious and grave as well. Like, brilliant. Like, just so imaginative, but also playing on age-old motifs of like grief and horror and familial bonds and revenge. It's a revenge story at its crux, really. But then also with the folklore element. Genius stuff. I can't wait to see what this director does next, to be honest. And I just thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought the performances from everyone involved were brilliant, like especially Noomi Rapace. Like, she is the star of this movie essentially. Not only because she's the most famous actor in it, but because it very much leans on her role as the mother to kind of really create thematic intensity and tension. But yeah, it's just so interesting. I feel like on a rewatch I could unpack even more of it. Also, let me know in the comments section what you thought of the movie, how you view it. Personally, I do very much see it as a fable on nature, what's natural, and kind of going against nature has consequences. Humans abusing the very nature of this beautiful planet, and Ram Man is here to shoot you down. I don't know. But yeah, anyway, thank you for watching. Have a lovely day, and I will see you again soon. Bye bye.